She had arranged for her mother-in-law to have the best palliative care team in all of Ottawa. What she had not arranged for was the woman who sat beside her every evening, holding her hand and singing old French songs neither of them had asked to remember. Renata Kowalczyk pulled into the driveway of the Ashby house on a Thursday afternoon in late October, 2 weeks earlier than planned. A client meeting in Montreal had collapsed, contracts unsigned, flights rerouted, the kind of professional disruption that had once rattled her. Now she simply redirected the car north along the 416 and told herself she was being efficient. She was not supposed to be home until the weekend. The house was quiet when she stepped inside. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the silence of emptiness, but something softer. The hallway smelled of warm bread and something herbal she couldn't immediately place. The kind of smell that belonged to a different house, an older house. A house where people stayed longer than they needed to. Renata set her bag at the foot of the stairs and listened. From the back of the house past the sunroom and through the corridor she rarely walked came a voice, low, unhurried, singing. She moved toward it before she understood she was moving. The door to Marguerite's room was half open. Renata paused it in the hallway, one hand resting against the wall. Marguerite Ashby sat in the armchair near the window, the one Renata had ordered specially because it adjusted for lumbar support and elevated the legs to reduce swelling. Her eyes were closed, her silver hair, what remained of it, was pinned loosely at the back of her head. A wool blanket covered her lap. Beside her, sitting on the small upholstered stool that usually held Marguerite's crossword books, was Solange. Solange Tremblay was the household assistant Renata had hired through an agency 11 months ago. She was 29, possibly 30. She cleaned, she organized, she managed the household calendar when Renata's own calendar overwhelmed everything else. She was not hired to sing to the dying, but she was singing, not performing, not filling the room with sound, just singing quietly in a voice that barely carried beyond the two of them. Her hands were folded in her lap and her eyes were lowered, and the song was something old and Quebecois that Renata couldn't name but somehow recognized from a place beneath words. Marguerite's hand rested on top of Solange's. Renata stood in the doorway and could not move. She had built a career on moving, on deciding, executing, redirecting, advancing. She had run a communications firm for 14 years. She had managed crises that would have leveled other people. She had flown to 3 cities in 4 days without checking once whether Marguerite had slept. She had paid for everything: the palliative team, the physiotherapist who came Tuesdays, the meal service, the medication management system she had researched for 2 weekends before selecting. She had paid for everything. And still her mother-in-law's hand was resting on the hand of a woman hired to vacuum the upstairs hallway. Renata stepped back from the doorway without making a sound. She walked to the kitchen. She sat down at the island she had designed herself and she did not move for a long time. Her husband Daniel Ashby had died 3 years ago. A heart attack at 51, sudden and complete, the kind that gave no warning and asked for no permission. He had been Marguerite's only child, and after the funeral, after the relatives returned to their cities and the casseroles ran out and the sympathy cards stopped coming, it had been Renata who remained, not because the law required it, not because anyone asked, but because Marguerite was 81 and her husband was gone, and Renata could not think of a version of herself that simply walked away. She had not, however, imagined how hard it would be to stay without knowing how. Renata ran her firm remotely most of the time. She traveled 3 or 4 days a month. She checked in on Marguerite by phone every other evening and received weekly updates from the palliative nurse Gail, who was thorough and professional and never once told her what Marguerite talked about when she couldn't sleep. 2 weeks earlier, Gail had written in her report, "Patient occasionally experiences elevated anxiety in the evenings. Manage with scheduled medication. Sleep patterns remain irregular." Renata had forwarded the report to her own files. She had approved the medication adjustment. She had not asked Marguerite what she was anxious about. She stood up from the island now and walked to the window. Outside, the maple in the backyard had gone entirely red. Daniel had planted it the year they moved in. He used to sit beneath it in a folding chair on summer mornings with terrible coffee and a library book, and no intention of being useful. She had always found that slightly maddening. Now she would give almost anything to watch him do it again. Her phone buzzed twice on the counter. She did not look at it. Behind her she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Then Solange appeared in the kitchen doorway, a folded blanket under her arm and a small mug in her hand. She stopped when she saw Renata. For a moment neither of them spoke. Renata turned. "She's asleep?" Solange nodded. "She usually rests for an hour around now." She set the mug in the sink and began to fold the blanket with the automatic efficiency of someone who did not expect to be in this room long. "I didn't know you were coming back early. I would have. You don't need to explain anything." Renata's voice came out more clipped than she intended. Old professional habit. She softened it. "How long has she been resting?" "About 20 minutes. Solange opened the linen cupboard near the laundry door and placed the blanket on the second shelf. Not the top shelf, Renata noticed. Marguerite couldn't reach the top shelf anymore. The song, Renata said. Solange was quiet for a moment. Parle-moi de ta mère. It's an old chanson, my grandmother used to sing it. She paused. Marguerite, Mrs. Ashby, recognized it last month. She asked me to sing it again. Renata looked at her. She asked you? Yes. When Solange's expression remained even. On a Tuesday night, around midnight. She'd had a difficult evening and I'd stayed to sit with her and she asked if I knew any songs my grandmother had taught me. Renata felt something shift behind her sternum. Carefully, precisely, she asked. You stayed until midnight. I stay most nights, Solange said. Not defiant, not apologetic. Just saying the thing that was true. The kitchen was very quiet. I see. Renata looked down at the counter. There was a small jar of honey beside the kettle that had not been there before, pale amber with a handwritten label from some farm she didn't recognize. That's not in your contract. Solange said nothing. You're paid until 7. I know. The overnight support is managed by the palliative team. I know that too. Solange folded her hands in front of her with a composure that was beginning to unsettle Renata in ways she couldn't easily name. But the palliative team comes at 9 and leaves at 11, and there are hours in between when she's awake and frightened. And would rather not ring the bell because she doesn't want to be a bother. She said that? She says it often. Renata pressed her fingertips to the edge of the counter. She was building a response in her mind, some reasonable professional reframe about scope of responsibility and caregiver boundaries, and the importance of sustainable systems. She had given a version of that speech at a conference in Calgary 2 years ago and been told it was very useful. She could not make herself say any of it now. What is she frightened of? She asked instead. Solange tilted her head slightly as if the question surprised her. Tonight specifically or in general? In general. Solange was quiet for a moment. The dark, she said finally. Not literally, she leaves the lamp on, but the quiet that comes with it. The feeling that time is moving and she's the only one awake to notice. She paused. She talks about Daniel. Renata went very still. She told me once that the hardest thing about being sick isn't the pain, Solange continued. It's having no one to tell the small things to. The things that don't matter enough to call someone about, but matter too much to just keep to yourself. The kettle on the stove began a low whistle, and Solange moved to take it off the heat without being asked. She poured water into a cup and added what looked like dried chamomile from a tin on the counter. Renata also did not remember purchasing. She likes this better than the prescribed sleep tea, Solange said. It doesn't make her feel foggy in the morning. Who told you she felt foggy? She did. Renata looked at the tin. She looked at the honey. She looked at this woman who was 29 or 30, who cleaned the upstairs hallway and stayed until midnight, because an 81-year-old woman didn't want to ring the bell. I'm going to need you to come to my office tomorrow morning, Renata said. Her voice had gone precise again. The conference voice. 9 o'clock. Solange looked at her without any particular alarm. Of course. She placed the chamomile tea on the tray beside the honey jar, lifted it and walked back toward Marguerite's room without another word. Renata stood alone in the kitchen for a long time after she was gone. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the bedroom at the end of the hall. The bedroom she had shared with Daniel for 19 years. The one she had not redecorated, because redecoration felt like a declaration she wasn't ready to make. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman she had never properly looked at. She had hired Solange from an agency. She had read the reference letters. She had conducted a 30-minute interview at this very kitchen island, practical and professional, asking about experience and reliability and discretion. She had offered a fair wage and clear expectations and a set of house keys. She had not, in 11 months, once asked Solange anything about herself. In the morning she went to Marguerite's room before her coffee. She knocked. She had not knocked before. She usually entered with a purpose, to check the medication log, to speak with Gail, to ask a functional question and receive a functional answer. She knocked now and waited. Come in, Marguerite said. She was awake. She was sitting up in bed with a library book open on her lap, though her reading glasses were on the nightstand rather than her face. The morning light was coming in at an angle that made her look small and still and more present than Renata had expected. You're here early, Marguerite said. I came home yesterday. Renata sat in the armchair, the adjustable one, and placed her hands on her knees. I saw Solange with you. Marguerite studied her for a moment. Yes, she was singing, she was. Marguerite's eyes didn't leave hers. Were you going to tell me what you want to say, or are we going to take turns stating things that already happened? Renata almost smiled, almost. I wanted to ask you something, then ask. Are you lonely? The word fell into the room without warning and lay there. Marguerite looked at her for a long moment. Then she set the library book aside. Sit closer, she said. Renata moved the chair. The feet dragged against the hardwood and the sound was embarrassingly loud, but she moved it. You are so like him, Marguerite said quietly. He also didn't know how to ask things until he couldn't avoid it any longer. Renata looked at her hands. Yes, Marguerite said. I am sometimes lonely, but not in the way you're probably thinking. She reached over and adjusted the blanket on her own lap, a small automatic gesture. I am not lonely for company. The team comes. Gail is a good woman, you call. She paused. I am lonely the way you're lonely when you can feel things ending and the people who love you are trying so hard not to look at that they end up not quite looking at you either. Renata's throat tightened. Solange looks at me, Marguerite said simply. She sees what I am now, not what I used to be and not what I will be in 6 months. She comes in and she sits down and she doesn't arrange her face into anything, she just sits. She shouldn't have to be doing this, Renata said. This isn't what she was hired for. Marguerite's eyes sharpened. And who exactly would you have preferred do it? The question was gentle and it was devastating. Renata said nothing. At 9 o'clock Solange knocked on the door of the small study Renata used when she worked from home. She sat across the desk with her jacket on and her hands in her lap, composed in a way that Renata was beginning to understand was not performance. It was simply how she was. Renata had prepared what she wanted to say. She had actually written notes, which she now recognized as absurd. But she had written them anyway because preparing notes was how she functioned. She set them aside. I owe you an apology, she said. Solange blinked. I have employed you for 11 months and I have never once asked you about yourself. I have treated this position as a logistics problem and you as part of the solution. And meanwhile you have been staying until midnight, buying. Renata paused. You have been buying things for this house. Solange's expression shifted just slightly. The honey, Renata said. The chamomile. The lavender lotion in the bathroom that wasn't on the household account. I didn't think, how much? Solange looked at the window. It's not a significant amount, it matters to me. Renata kept her voice even. How much, Solange? Solange named a figure. It was 3 months of small purchases. Modest, careful amounts. The kind that suggested someone who had done the arithmetic and bought only what they were confident wouldn't be excessive. The kind of arithmetic you did when you were spending your own money. Renata sat back. She thought of the palliative invoices she signed monthly without registering the line items. She thought of the specialist she had flown in from Toronto last spring, because the Ottawa team had given her a recommendation she hadn't trusted. She had not hesitated for a single moment over that invoice. She had never once noticed the honey. You should have told me, Renata said. I would have reimbursed you. Solange shook her head very slightly. I wasn't supposed to be doing any of it. Asking for reimbursement would have meant explaining what I was doing, and I didn't know if you'd want me to stop. Did you think I would? Solange met her eyes. I didn't know you well enough to know. The honesty of that landed harder than any accusation could have. Renata looked at the notes she had written and not used. Points 1 through 5, organized by category, structured for a 20-minute conversation with a clear outcome. She turned the page over. Why did you stay? She asked. The first night you stayed past 7. What made you do it? Solange was quiet for a moment. She was having a hard evening. The team had come and gone. I was putting on my coat and she stopped. She said, you don't have to go yet if you don't want to. She said that, yes. Solange looked at the window again. It was the if you don't want to that got me. Not please don't go. Not I need you to stay. She gave me the choice and she made it sound like staying might be something I wanted to do, instead of something she needed. Because she didn't want to be a burden. Renata's chest hurt. My father said the same kind of thing, Solange said quietly. When he was sick, he would ask us if we wanted tea, if we were comfortable, if there was something good on television. Never once said he was scared. Never once said he didn't want to be alone. She folded her hands. He died while my mother was in the next room making him tea he hadn't asked for. The study was very still. I didn't want that to happen to her, Solange said, to Mrs. Ashby. Renata stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room. Outside the maple was burning red in the October light, and she thought about Daniel in his folding chair and his terrible coffee, and she thought about how she had never once sat outside with him in the morning, because mornings were for email. She had always assumed there would be more mornings. I moved too fast, she said. After Daniel died, I told myself I was being practical, keeping things running, keeping this house functioning. Looking after Marguerite properly. She kept her eyes on the maple, but the truth is that whenever I slow down I feel it. And feeling it's very hard. Behind her Solange said nothing. She did not fill the silence with comfort, she simply let it be. After a moment Renata turned back. I'd like to change your contract, she said. Your hours, your compensation, all of it. I'd like to formalize what you've actually been doing, if you're willing to keep doing it. And I'd like you to tell Marguerite's palliative team everything you've observed. The anxiety, the sleep, what helps and what doesn't. You have information they don't have. Solange looked at her carefully. I'd like that. And from now on, anything she needs, you tell me directly. You don't spend your own money on this house. Solange nodded once. Thank you, don't, Renata said quietly. I should have noticed. It was my responsibility to notice. She held the door open and Solange walked out. Renata stood in the study alone for several minutes before she moved. That afternoon she did not open her laptop. She sent 2 emails, brief and final, moving 2 meetings to the following week. Her assistant wrote back with 4 questions and she answered only 1. Then she went to Marguerite's room. Marguerite looked up from her crossword, surprised. Is something wrong? Nothing's wrong. Renata pulled the stool close to the armchair and sat down. It was the stool Solange usually sat on. It was lower than she expected and slightly uncomfortable. She sat on it anyway. Tell me about the song she sings to you. Marguerite looked at her for a moment. Then something in her face eased, quietly. The way a room eases when someone turns a light on in it. It's the kind of song, she said, that sounds like someone else's memory until you've heard it enough times that it becomes your own. Renata listened. That was how it started. She did not transform overnight. That was the part no one tells you. How long learning takes when you've spent years being competent at the wrong things. She made mistakes. She arrived in Marguerite's room too briskly with too many questions, the habit of efficiency difficult to unlearn. She asked about pain before she asked about anything else. She once suggested, because she genuinely could not think what else to say, that they review the upcoming appointment schedule together. And Marguerite had looked at her with such exquisite patience that Renata had to look away. Solange, without being asked, quietly taught her. Not formally. Not with instruction. She simply went about the room in her unhurried way, and Renata watched and paid attention for the first time. She learned that Marguerite liked the curtain left open until 3 in the afternoon. When the angle of autumn light became too sharp, she learned that Gail's professional pleasantness was reassuring but thin, that Marguerite wanted to be spoken to like herself, not like a patient, and that the fastest way to do that was simply to say something true. She learned that silence was not the same as absence, that sitting in a room reading while Marguerite slept was itself a form of being present, and that Marguerite noticed. She always noticed. One evening in November, Renata stayed after the palliative team left and Solange had gone home. It was the first time she had done that. The first time she had remained in the house past 9 without the buffer of someone else's presence. Marguerite woke near 11. She lay in the semi-dark with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling, and Renata was there in the chair when she turned her head. You stayed, Marguerite said. I stayed the whole evening, most of it. Marguerite looked at her. Are you all right? Renata almost laughed. I'm supposed to be asking you that. You can do both. She thought about it honestly. I'm not all right yet, she said, but I think I'm getting better at letting myself not be. Marguerite reached her hand out across the blanket. Renata took it. For a while they were quiet, the lamp on low and the house around them settled into its November creaking. Then Marguerite said, he used to do this, too. You know Daniel, when he was small and I was the one who was sick. He would drag his quilt into my room and sleep on the floor beside the bed, because he didn't want me to be alone. But he also didn't want to bother me. A small sound that was almost a laugh. I would wake up and find him curled at the foot of the bed like a very loyal dog. Renata smiled, and her eyes filled at the same moment, which was somehow exactly right. He told me once, Marguerite continued, that he only felt safe when he could hear me breathing. Renata pressed her other hand over Marguerite's. Her throat was tight. I understand that now, she said softly, more than I used to. Marguerite's fingers tightened around hers. They stayed that way until her mother-in-law drifted back to sleep. The trouble came on a Friday morning in December, the kind of cold morning that arrived with purpose, the sky a flat and honest gray. Renata was sitting in the kitchen with her second coffee. When she heard footsteps she recognized as belonging to neither Solange nor any member of the palliative team. Colette Ashby appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing a wool coat she hadn't taken off, and the particular expression of someone who had decided what they were going to say well before they arrived. Colette was Daniel's cousin. She was 54, or near enough. She had come to Ottawa 3 times in the past 2 years, once for Daniel's memorial, once for Christmas, once for reasons Renata had never fully understood. She sent cards with handwritten notes that sounded warm until you read them carefully. She lived in Vancouver. She had strong opinions about how things should be managed and had, in Renata's experience, never been required to manage anything herself. I thought I should come, Colette said, sitting down at the island without being invited. Now that Marguerite is in the final stage. Renata set down her mug. She's not in the final stage. She's in palliative care, which can include quite a range of, you know what I mean. Colette looked around the kitchen with the specific alertness of someone cataloging what they find. Her eyes settled on the chamomile tin. I've been speaking with the family. The Ashby family. She said it with slight emphasis that Renata chose not to respond to. We have some concerns about the care arrangement. Renata's expression remained even. Gail's team has been excellent. The medical support is very thorough. I'm not talking about the medical team. Colette turned her mug in her hands, a gesture that managed to look both casual and pointed. I'm talking about the household assistant. The kitchen was quiet. Solange, Renata said. She's taken on a significant role, Colette said. More than seems appropriate for someone in her position. I've heard from Marguerite's neighbor, Diane, you know Diane, that the car in the driveway's sometimes there past midnight. That's correct. Colette blinked. And you're comfortable with that? I arranged it, Renata said. Solange has been with Marguerite through the most difficult months of this illness. She has provided care that the rest of us, myself included, were not providing. Colette set down her mug. Renata, she's staff, she's a person, who is not a family member, who has, from what I understand, become quite involved in a situation that requires. What exactly does it require? Renata asked. Her voice was completely level. Colette, tell me specifically what you believe should be happening differently in this house. Colette opened her mouth, closed it. Because what I know, Renata continued, is that 6 months ago, Marguerite was not sleeping. She was anxious every night after the team left. She was lying awake in the dark not wanting to ring the bell because she was afraid of being a burden. I didn't know that. I was managing everything correctly from a distance and I did not know that. She picked up her coffee mug. Solange knew. The kitchen held very still. Family is not a category, Renata said, it's a practice. Solange has been practicing it here every night when the rest of us weren't. Colette looked at the counter. Something shifted in her face. Not a transformation, but a small, honest rearrangement. I didn't know it was like that. Quieter now. Neither did I. Renata set down the mug. And now I do. And I'm staying. Colette left before lunch. She didn't leave angry. She left the way people leave when they've been asked to account for something, and found the accounting uncomfortable but fair. She paused in the hallway and said, she might come back in the new year. Renata said that would be welcome if she meant it. The door closed. The house settled back into itself. Renata stood at the foot of the stairs for a moment and then she went up. Solange was in Marguerite's room, setting fresh water on the nightstand. Marguerite was awake and asking something about a recipe. A specific way of doing something with apples. That she couldn't quite remember. And Solange was saying she thought it involved brown sugar and she could look it up if Marguerite wanted. It was completely ordinary and it was the most alive the room had sounded in months. Renata leaned against the doorframe. The recipe is in the blue binder, she said. Third shelf, the kitchen, beside the cookbooks from the 70s that Daniel would never let me throw out. Marguerite looked at her. Solange looked at her. He made it every Christmas, Renata said. He was terrible at it the first 4 times. Then suddenly he wasn't. She came into the room properly. The trick is more nutmeg than you think you need. Marguerite smiled with her whole face. They spent the afternoon like that. No agenda. No schedule. Solange found the recipe and read it aloud. Marguerite corrected 2 of the steps from memory. Renata made tea. Proper tea, not the sleep tea, not the chamomile, just the orange pekoe Marguerite had drunk every afternoon since before Renata had known her. And she got it almost right and only had to ask Solange once. Later, when Marguerite had drifted into her afternoon rest, Renata stood at the window watching the maple. It was bare now. November had finished what October started. She told me she's not afraid, Solange said quietly from across the room. Renata turned. She said she was afraid in the summer. But she's not afraid now. Solange folded a towel that didn't need folding. She said it's because the house feels different. Renata looked at the maple. She said it feels occupied, Solange added, like someone is home. Renata nodded once, not trusting her voice. That evening she moved her laptop to the small table in the corridor just outside Marguerite's room. Her assistant sent 11 messages, she answered 3. When Marguerite's light came on near midnight, Renata was already awake. She pushed the door open quietly and stood in the frame. I'm here, she said. Marguerite reached for the lamp without turning it on. I know, she said. I can hear you breathing. Renata crossed the room and sat beside her. Outside the window, the first snow of December was beginning to fall, small and unhurried. The kind that didn't stick, not yet, but filled the air with something that looked in the lamplight like patience. Marguerite passed away on a Sunday in February. In the room with the window she had asked to keep open a crack, the cold air coming in thin and clean. Renata was beside her, holding her hand. Solange stood near the door. There was no dramatic last sentence. There was just a breath and then gently the absence of another one. Renata did not look away. In the months that followed she made one significant decision about the house. She kept it. She had expected to sell it, had even spoken to an agent once, but she found she couldn't. The rooms had become something they hadn't been before. They had become lived in the right way. The way that happens when people stop managing a space and start inhabiting it. She established a small fund in Marguerite's name. Not a foundation, nothing institutional, just a directed fund through a local hospice. For the specific purpose of supporting the overnight hours. The hours between the last check of the evening and the first light of morning. The hours when the palliative team has gone home and the house is too quiet and someone needs to be there. She asked Solange to help decide how it should be used. Solange stayed on, not as a household assistant. That description had never quite fit. But as someone who continued to show up, who continued to notice things, who continued to understand that being useful wasn't always the same as doing something. Renata continued to run her firm. She still traveled, still took calls, still moved through the professional world with the competence she had built over 20 years. But she no longer confused competence with care. She no longer believed that managing something from a distance was the same as being present for it. And every December she made the apple cake. She was still not very good at it. She used more nutmeg than she thought she needed, as Daniel had, and every year it came out slightly differently. But she made it. She sat at the kitchen island with flour on her hands and the blue binder open beside her, and the particular feeling of doing something slow and imperfect and necessary. And on those evenings, the house smelled like warm bread and something sweet, and something human. And she let herself feel it, the grief and the love and the gratitude, all of it at once, without trying to manage any of it. Because her mother-in-law had taught her, in the final quiet months of her life, the thing that neither success nor love had managed to teach her on its own, that the people we are given do not need us to be capable, they need us to be close. And if we have spent years being capable from a distance, we can still choose, even late, even imperfectly, to close that distance. The chance to say I'm here does not always wait, but sometimes if we are lucky it waits long enough.